Interpreter of Maladies is a short story which is written by Jumpa Lahiri. It is taken from a collection of stories called Interpreter of Maladies. So, as a migrant writer, Jumpa Lahiri's writing shows a lot of Indian nuances, and there is a lot of cultural factors in her writing too. In this story, we find that there is mainly a story like this. There is this Das family who come from America to India for a vacation, and they hire Mr. Kapasi as their tour guide. So what happens throughout the journey is that we understand that this Hindu family who has migrated to America does not resemble a typical Hindu family. So the guide is a little bit shocked about that. For example, how the children do not even listen to the father, and also about the free relationships and the free talk of Mrs. Das, and the way she outspoke about the illegal child she has got, etc. And then there is some information about an emerging, a possibility for an emerging relationship between the guide and sisters. But then, because of this scene revolved around a monkey trying to bite a child, this whole thing does not proceed because they lose addresses, photos, everything. So this is actually a story that makes us understand about migration, culture, family relationships, impact on modernism, and so many other things. This short story collection was published in 1999 as part of Jumpa Lahiri's Pulitzer Prize winning collection. And in other words, this short story Interpreter of Maladies was actually taken from from a collection of stories. And she tries to explore the themes of communication, identity, and emotional disconnection from this story. The story revolves around, as we have already got to know, a day trip taken by the Das family, Indian Americans who visit India, and their tour guide, Mr. Kapasi. Throughout the narrative, Lahiri delves into the complexities of cultural identity, emotional isolation, and the longing for meaningful human connection. The story is set in India, where the Das family, husband Raj, wife Neena, and their three children are on vacation. They hire Mr. Kapasi as their tour guide to take them to the Sun Temple of Konarak. Mr. Kapasi is an educated man who works as an interpreter in a doctor's office, helping patients who do not speak the same language as their doctor. He sees this as a mundane job, but becomes intrigued when Mrs. Das expresses interest in it, calling it romantic. As the day goes on, Mr. Kapasi fantasizes about a connection with Mrs. Das, projecting his own emotional desires onto her curiosity. However, Mrs. Das is not interested in him in a romantic or emotional way. During the trip, she reveals a dark secret to Mr. Kapasi. Her middle child, Bobby, was not fathered by a husband but by a friend of the family. She is burdened by guilt but detached from her family, seeking some kind of absolution from Mr. Kapasi. Mr. Kapasi is shocked and disillusioned, realizing that Mrs. Das was never interested in him beyond her own emotional needs. The story ends with Bobby being attacked by monkeys and Mr. Kapasi's slip of paper with his address, which he had hoped Mrs. Das would use to contact him, flies away in the wind, symbolizing the broken and unattainable connection. Theme-wise, first of all and mainly, the writer focuses on emotional and cultural disconnection. As its core, Interpreter of Maladies explores the theme of emotional isolation, particularly within relationships. The Das family, though physically together, is emotionally distant from one another. Mrs. Das is disconnected from her husband and children, displaying little interest in their well-being. Her affair and the subsequent emotional detachment reflect a deep sense of dissatisfaction and alienation. Similarly, Mr. Kapasi feels disconnected in his own life. His job as an interpreter, which requires him to bridge communication between others, ironically highlights his own inability to connect meaningfully with people, including his wife, whose coldness mirrors Mrs. Das's detachment. Lahiri shows how cultural dislocation between Indian Americans in India and personal disconnection can lead to feelings of alienation and fragmentation in relationships. The other theme that the writer displays is miscommunication and the future failure of language. Language, both literal and symbolic, plays a crucial role in the story. Mr. Kapas's job as an interpreter symbolizes his role as a mediator of communication, but it also highlights the limitation of language in fostering genuine human connection. Although he helps people communicate in medical settings, his own life is marked by miscommunication and emotional estrangement or separation or detachment, both at home and with Mrs. Das. Mrs. Das seeks out Mr. Kapasi not because she genuinely wants to understand his life, but because she wants to unburden herself of her guilt. She mistakes Mr. Kapasi's role as an interpreter of symptoms for someone who can offer emotional interpretation, perhaps even absolution or cleanliness. They or like sort of cleaning. This miscommunication leads to Mr. Kapas's disillusionment, as he had imagined that their conversation could lead to a deeper, more personal connection. Guilt and confession is another idea that the writer brings out. Guilt and the need for confession are central to Mrs. Das's character. Her affair and her resulting secret have created an emotional chasm between her and her family, particularly with Bobby, who she feels no connection to because of the circumstances of his birth. She carries a guilt with her but has not sought forgiveness or reconciliation with her family. Instead, she confesses her secret to Mr. Kapasi, a stranger seeking some form of emotional release. She believes that Mr. Kapasi's role as an interpreter of maladies extends to interpreting her emotional pain. Yet, this is a misinterpretation of his role. Her confession, rather than bringing her the relief she seeks, leaves both her and Mr. Kapasi unsatisfied, as he cannot offer the absolution she desires. This reinforces the theme that emotional maladies cannot be cured by simple confessions. They require genuine connection and understanding, which Mrs. Das avoids with the family. Cultural identity and dislocation is another important idea. Lahiri's characters, particularly the Das family, experience a sense of cultural dislocation. Though they are of Indian descent, they are culturally American, and their interactions with Mr. Kapasi highlight the gap between their Indian heritage and their American identity. The Das family's behavior, such as their casual disregard for Indian customs and their overall detachment from the cultural significance of their surroundings, emphasizes the cultural divide between them and Mr. Kapasi, who embodies a more traditional Indian lifestyle. The story subtly examines how this dislocation impacts their understanding of themselves and their relationships. Mrs. Das, in particular, seems disconnected from her roots as seen in her indifference to India's culture and her family's history. The children's behavior, such as their disobedience and disrespect for local customs, reflects a lack of connection to their heritage, further emphasizing the family's cultural and emotional distance. Fantasy versus reality is another idea Jumpa Lahiri brings out. Throughout the story, Mr. Kapasi indulges in fantasies about Mrs. Das, projecting his desires for emotional connection and escape from his monotonous life onto her. He imagines a relationship with her, one in which they communicate regularly and share a deep understanding. However, these fantasies are based on misinterpretation and wishful thinking. Mrs. Das, on the other hand, seeks a solution to her emotional malaise in Mr. Kapasi, imagining that he can offer her the comfort or guidance she needs. Both characters are caught in their own illusions, and by the end of the story, these fantasies are shattered. Mr. Kapasi realizes that Mrs. Das was never interested in him beyond her own need for confession, and Mrs. Das receives no emotional relief from revealing her secret. This disconnect between fantasy and reality underscores a broader theme of miscommunication and unmet desires, even within a family. Symbols wise, Mr. Kapasi's job becomes very symbolic. Mr. Kapasi's role as an interpreter is symbolic of his larger function in the story as a mediator between cultures and emotions. However, just as his job involves interpreting symptoms, not emotions, he is unable to truly connect with or interpret Mr. Das's emotional needs. His work becomes a metaphor for the limitations of communication and understanding in human relationships. The Sun Temple and monkeys are also important symbols. The Sun Temple is a major tourist attraction in the story. It represents the ancient cultural heritage of India and it contrasts with the modern disconnected lives of the Das family. The monkeys, which become increasingly menacing throughout the story, can be seen as symbols of the chaos and uncontrollable forces beneath the surface of seemingly calm or ordinary lives. When Bobby is attacked by the monkeys, it signifies the consequences of the emotional neglect and secrets within the Das family. The flying address. At the end of the story, can you remember the slip of paper with Mr. Kapasi's address flies away, symbolizing the loss of the connection he had hoped for? It underscores the futility of his fantasy and the emotional distance between him and Mrs. Stars, as well as a theme of miscommunication and missed opportunities. So, in conclusion, we can state that Interpret of Maladies is a complex story about the challenges of communication both across cultural divides and within personal relationships. Through the characters of Mr. Kapasi and Mrs. Stars, Jumpa Lahiri explores the ways in which people project their own desires and needs onto others, often leading to disillusionment. The story also raises important questions about the meaning of cultural identity and the emotional consequences of disconnection, making it a poignant exploration of human relationships in the context of both personal and cultural malaise. So, if you need to practice this story more, you can write an appreciation on it, referring to plot, event sense, theme, emotions, tone, characters, characterization, message, theme, techniques, and judgment. And you can write an essay on the following question, that is, comment on the way Jumpa Lahiri brings out the theme of cultural identity and dislocation through this story.